June 4th, 1940. The dawn hung low and heavy over the grey waters off the English Channel, a cold ribbon of mist curling along the surface like the breath of something ancient. The sea was deceptively calm, just a slow rise and fall, the kind that made a man feel as though the whole world were rocking him gently to sleep. But every man on the small Royal Navy auxiliary trawler HMS Kestrel knew better. It was the second week of relentless German air scouting across Britain's coastal lanes, and the Luftwaffe had grown bold, dipping low over the channel to hunt for the smallest signs of Allied troop movement. Every ship, no matter how insignificant, was being watched. 26-year-old able seaman Thomas "Tom" Whitcomb stood near the bow, leaning on the salt-chipped railing, his pipe clenched between his teeth, though he hadn't lit it yet. The little trawler smelled of diesel, rope, rust, and the wet timbers that never quite dried. Tom was known aboard as the quiet one, the tinkerer, the man who could make anything out of anything. Some joked he could build a battleship with spare bolts and paint cans. Others simply shook their heads when he'd disappear into the lower compartments for hours, re-emerging with some strange contraption that either saved the ship or nearly set it on fire. But on this morning, Tom wasn't thinking about jokes. His eyes traced the strip of horizon where the clouds thinned just enough to show the faint outline of France in the distance. That's where the danger came from. The German scouts flew low, fast, and often without warning. Already, 3 coastal vessels had been spotted and marked for later attacks. A scout plane could mean death, not today, not now, but soon, once the bombers learned what it had seen. Tom knew the risk better than most. Born in Portsmouth to a shipbuilder father and a school-teacher mother, he'd grown up around the shipyards where every bolt mattered, every tool had purpose, and every flaw killed a man later. He'd enlisted just before the war, still filled with a young man's stubborn certainty that he'd find some way to make himself useful. But he hadn't expected to become useful in this way, not in the bizarre, improvised fashion that would soon make the Kestrel a whispered topic in naval mess halls. At mid-morning, the sea brightened, the mist beginning to burn off, and with it came that faint vibration in the sky that Tom had learned to dread. It wasn't loud, just a thin, insect-like pulse, like a steel-winged mosquito that promised far more than a bite. He stiffened and turned his head slowly toward the southeast. There it was. A tiny, dark speck, no bigger than a gnat, moving against the clouds with a predatory ease. "Plane!" shouted the lookout, but Tom was already moving. The Kestrel had no proper anti-aircraft weaponry, just a pair of aging Lewis guns and a stern-mounted Vickers that sputtered like an old man's lungs. The guns worked fine against slow targets, but a fast, nimble German scout plane, likely an H-126 or a Fieseler Storch, would dance around them like a cat avoiding a swinging boot. Lieutenant Harrington, their commanding officer, stormed out of the wheelhouse, binoculars raised. "Damn it, he's early today. Gunnery crews to stations." Men scrambled to the Lewis guns, already knowing the odds. Harrington knew it too. Once spotted, their position would be radioed back. Then bombers, dozens, maybe scores, would find them before dusk. The Kestrel would become one more wreck drifting somewhere along the channel floor. Tom didn't head to the guns. He sprinted down the companionway, boots thudding against metal steps as he shoved open the hatch to the lower workshop. He slid inside, breathing the familiar air of machine oil and damp rope. His hands shook, not with fear but urgency, as he dragged out a crate he had tucked behind a broken depth charge bracket days earlier. Inside was the thing no one aboard had believed in except him, the pipe cannon. At least, that's what the others nicknamed it when he first showed the rough sketches. To Tom, it wasn't a cannon, just pressure, angle, ignition, mathematics, and stubbornness wrapped in welded steel. It was nothing more than a crude launcher built from scavenged piping, a reinforced elbow joint, a set of threaded couplings, and a powder ignition system cannibalized from a flare trigger and a cut-down Lee-Enfield bolt housing. He had designed it originally to help launch signal flares farther, maybe hurl small weighted lines across the water, but then he started thinking, if the Germans could improvise weapons, why couldn't the British sailor stuck on a trawler, armed with nothing better than polite curses. He lifted the awkward metal tube, nearly 5 feet long, thick-walled, capped at one end and fitted with a crude firing lever. Weighted bolts lay beside it, steel rods wrapped with stabilizing fins he had hammered together from scrap tin plates. The ship suddenly shook. Men shouted above. The plane was making a pass. Tom clamped the launcher under one arm and climbed, boots pounding, breath burning. He emerged onto the deck just as the scout plane streaked overhead, low, fast, the sun glinting off its wings. The Lewis guns barked in frustration, their tracers bending uselessly in the wind. "Whitcomb!" Harrington barked. "Not now! Get to the guns!" Tom shook his head, sprinting toward the port side, shouting back, "Just buy me 3 minutes! What in God's name do you think?" But Tom didn't hear the rest. He was already dropping to one knee near a coil of rope, bracing the pipe cannon on a crate, angling it up with intense precision. The plane turned sharply in the distance, banking for another scouting swoop. It wasn't attacking, yet. It was observing, watching, cataloguing, and Tom was watching it back. He slid the first bolt into the pipe, securing it with a twist and locking the improvised breech. His fingers moved with a calm that belied the pounding of his chest. He had tested the launcher twice before, once firing into the water, another time firing into an old buoy. Both shots had flown straight, powerful, terrifyingly fast, but never at a moving target. "Tom!" shouted a deckhand. "Are you mad? You'll blow your arm clean off!" Tom didn't reply. He raised the pipe cannon slightly, adjusting by instinct, feeling the wind against his cheek, listening to the engine's pitch. The scout plane was looping back, descending into a shallow dive, wings tilting, its belly now clearly visible. He exhaled slowly, one long, steady breath. He waited. The sea rose beneath them, the ship lifting slightly with the swell. Perfect timing, perfect height. The plane aligned. Tom pulled the lever. A violent crack erupted from the launcher, the recoil slamming into his shoulder hard enough to jar his teeth. A streak of steel shot into the sky, whistling as it tore upward in a perfect arc. For one impossible moment, time stalled. Then the bolt struck, clean into the underside of the scout plane's fuselage. A metallic thud echoed across the water. The plane jolted violently, banking left in a wounded spiral. Smoke puffed from its engine cowling, its wings wobbling as if suddenly unsure of the air around them. Shouts erupted across the deck. "You hit it! It's going down! Bloody hell, Whitcomb!" The scout plane tried to climb, tried to correct, but the damaged engine sputtered, coughed, and failed. Its nose dipped. Its left wing clipped the air wrong, twisting the entire craft off balance. The pilot fought, wobbling, struggling, the plane skittering like a wounded bird. Tom didn't blink. He loaded a second bolt. The plane limped past, low, barely 50 yards off the port bow. Smoke trailed heavily behind it. Tom adjusted the cannon again. Another shot, another whistle. The second bolt ripped through the tail assembly, sending splinters of metal spiraling into the air. The plane buckled. Its tail dropped sharply. The aircraft nosed downward toward the sea, engines screaming as it fought gravity and lost. It hit the water with a burst of foam and shattered wood, sinking nose first into the cold channel within seconds. Silence followed. Just the hush of waves lapping against the Kestrel's hull. Then the cheering began. Men who had moments ago prepared for death now pounded Tom on the back, shouting, laughing, stunned. Harrington staggered forward, binoculars dangling uselessly from his neck, his mouth opening and closing like a man trying to relearn speech. "Whitcomb," he finally managed. What was that?" Tom looked down at the pipe cannon resting across his knees, its metal warm, smoking faintly. He shrugged, wiping soot from his brow. "Just something I built, sir." Harrington blinked. "You shot down a German scout plane? With plumbing?" Tom tapped the side of the pipe with mild embarrassment. "Reinforced plumbing, sir." Above them, the mist parted fully for the first time that morning, revealing a stretch of brightening sky. The Kestrel was safe, For now. Not marked, not hunted, not doomed to be sunk before nightfall. And all because one British sailor refused to accept that a small ship had to be a helpless one. Tom stood slowly, cradling his improvised cannon, a quiet pride settling in his eyes as the sea breathed softly beneath the ship. He didn't smile. He simply stared at the horizon, thinking not of the danger just past, but of the next challenge, the next device, the next impossible problem he might solve with nothing but scraps and determination. Because war wasn't always won by the largest guns. Sometimes it was won by the man who could turn a piece of pipe into a miracle. The sea carried the remains of the downed German scout plane away until the wreckage became no more than a faint smear of oil on the horizon. The men aboard the Kestrel kept glancing back toward that quiet patch of water, as if expecting pieces of the aircraft to rise up again in disbelief. For several long minutes, the ship sailed without words, the wind tugging gently at their uniforms, the ropes creaking in rhythm with the swell. It wasn't until Tom lowered the pipe cannon onto the deck, his arms shaking slightly from the recoil and the adrenaline, that the strange silence finally broke. A few sailors approached him cautiously, half amazed, half afraid of the still smoking contraption. They looked at it the way one might look at a relic discovered in a temple. Fascination edged with suspicion. "How in God's name did you even think of it?" one of them asked. Tom wiped his palms on his trousers, suddenly aware of how much they were trembling. "You watch enough things fly through the air at odd angles," he murmured. "You start figuring out what makes them stay straight." The men exchanged glances, as if that explanation somehow made the act even more unbelievable. Above them, Lieutenant Harrington paced the deck, muttering to himself. He had seen improvisations in war, broken radios mended with scrap wiring, jammed turret bearings freed with brute force and profanity, even a depth charge repaired with a hammer and a prayer. But this was something different. A sailor had taken pipes, tin scraps, and flare igniters and brought down a German aircraft, not scared it off, not forced it to break away, shot it down, in 3 minutes. By midday, the sky had cleared into a washed-out blue, sunlight sparkling across the channel in patches that reminded Tom of broken mirrors. The men resumed their duties, though their eyes kept drifting toward him, unable to hide the subtle awe. Tom wanted none of it. Praise made him uncomfortable. He preferred the quiet corner of the lower deck, where he could tinker unseen, yet now he felt the weight of the pipe cannon in a new way, as if the moment of triumph had burdened it with an expectation he wasn't sure he could ever meet again. He carried it below deck, securing it carefully onto the table where he had first assembled it. Then he stared at it, turning the events over in his mind. Had it really worked? The recoil still pulsed through his shoulder, a dull, reassuring ache. The second bolt's strike still rang faintly in his ears, a clean, sharp note of impact he knew would stay with him long after the war. The door creaked open behind him. Harrington stepped inside, ducking slightly beneath the low frame. For a long moment, he didn't speak. He looked around the cramped workshop. Crates, coiled ropes, brass fittings, metal shavings on the floor. Then he walked over to the pipe cannon and circled it slowly, his expression unreadable. "You built this without authorization," Harrington said quietly. Tom swallowed. "Yes, sir." "You tested this without reporting it?" "Yes, sir." "You could have blown yourself up?" "Yes, sir, but I didn't." Harrington paused, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "No. No, you didn't. In fact, you did the precise opposite." He turned, finally meeting Tom's eyes. "You saved this ship, Whitcomb. You saved all of us." Tom shifted awkwardly. "I just did what I thought might work, sir." "That's not what sailors usually do, Whitcomb. What sailors usually do is follow procedure, rely on proper armament, and hope the enemy gives them a fair chance. You didn't wait for a fair chance. You built one." Tom wasn't sure how to respond to that. He looked down at his hands, rough with calluses and streaked with oil. He didn't feel heroic. He felt unsettled, as though he had opened a door he wasn't meant to open. Harrington sighed, placing his hands behind his back. The Admiralty will want to know about this. Tom stiffened. Am I in trouble, sir? Harrington actually chuckled, a rare, clipped sound that startled both of them. In trouble? Whitcomb, you shot down an enemy aircraft with a pipe. If anything, you're going to confuse the hell out of a dozen senior officers before the weekends. Tom let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Harrington placed a hand on his shoulder, another rare gesture. Get some rest, the lieutenant said softly. This war isn't done with us yet. The afternoon rolled on, the Kestrel continuing its slow patrol route. The Channel wind grew stronger, carrying with it the scent of distant storms. Tom returned topside in the late day, watching the water darken as clouds thickened overhead. He thought about the German pilot, about the brief flash of the cockpit window before the plane spiraled downward. He wondered if the man survived the impact, if the sea had swallowed him whole, or if he was clinging somewhere to floating debris, praying for rescue that would never come. Tom wasn't a man built for killing. He had always hoped to use his hands to make things, not end things. Yet here he was, responsible for sending another man into the water. Even if that man had been scouting them, marking them for bombing, Tom felt a hollow ache settle deep in his chest. Victory didn't feel like he expected it would. It was quieter, heavier. By late afternoon, the wind turned sharp, slapping the waves into restless ridges. The lookout spotted something on the northern horizon. 2 faint specks moving low across the sky. For a moment, panic prickled along the deck, but the shapes resolved into British aircraft returning from a coastal sweep. The tension eased, though not fully. War had a way of reminding men how quickly calm could vanish. As evening approached, the crew gathered around the mess tables, bowls of lukewarm stew steaming in their hands. Talk inevitably drifted back to the morning's events. "Reckon the Germans will send another one after us?" a young sailor asked. "Not today," another replied. "Word's probably already gone back that one scout never returned." "And what? They think it hit a bird?" Laughter rippled through the group. Tom smiled faintly, but stayed quiet. He knew the Luftwaffe didn't underestimate anything. They learned fast. They adapted faster. If a scout plane went missing along a predictable route, they'd come looking. Not scouts next time. Fighters. Or worse. The thought sent a chill running down his spine. When the mess hall cleared, Tom stepped outside into the cool evening air. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a pale band of fading orange. He moved toward the bow, letting the spray collect on his face. The deck lights flickered to life one by one, weak halos in the gathering dusk. He didn't notice Harrington standing beside him until the lieutenant spoke. "Could you build another one?" Tom blinked. "Another launcher, sir?" "Yes." Tom hesitated. "I suppose I could, but it wasn't meant for real engagement. It was more an idea. Something to try. And it worked," Harrington said quietly. Tom leaned on the railing, gazing at the waves splitting beneath the ship's hull. "If the Germans come back with a proper fighter, it won't be enough." "Maybe not," Harrington admitted. "But I'd rather fight with ingenuity than surrender to inevitability." Tom considered this. War didn't ask permission before demanding impossible things. Men either rose to meet them or died wishing they had tried. He found himself nodding, a slow, reluctant agreement forming in his bones. "I'll refine it," Tom said at last. "Make it safer, stronger, more predictable, and I'll build more bolts, better ones." Harrington smiled, barely visible in the dim light. "That's all I needed to hear." Night wrapped around the Kestrel, and the sea became a shifting black plain beneath the stars. Tom returned to his workshop, relighting the lantern, casting long shadows across the room. He ran his fingers along the pipe cannon, feeling every imperfection, every crude weld. Then he retrieved a fresh length of pipe, heavier and thicker than the first. If he was going to build something again, it would not simply be a replication, it would be an evolution. He pulled out tools, measuring rods, scraps of metal, and bolts. The workshop filled with the soft clink of metal on metal, the scrape of a file, the steady rhythm of a man who had decided his strange creation would no longer be just an accident of desperation. It would become something real, something the Kestrel could rely on, something Britain might soon whisper about. The lantern flame flickered as Tom worked deep into the night, unaware that the next dawn would bring a threat far greater than a lone scout plane, and that his improvised pipe cannon would soon face a test no one had imagined. The storm rolled in before dawn, a low growl across the channel that made the Kestrel pitch gently even before the rain began. The sky was a heavy slate, bruised with darker streaks that hinted at the violence waiting above the clouds. Tom barely noticed the shifting weather as he worked. He'd fallen asleep at the workshop table, only briefly, his forehead resting near a pile of metal shavings, one hand still gripping a half-filed stabilizer fin. When the ship lurched sharply and a tin coupling clattered onto the floor, he jolted awake, blinking into the dim lantern light. He didn't feel the exhaustion until he stood. His back cracked, his hands trembled from overuse, and the smell of oil had settled into his clothes. The new launcher lay before him on the table, reinforced, tightened, improved in ways he hadn't even planned. The barrel length was slightly increased, the breech-locking system better aligned, the ignition mechanism redesigned to reduce the violent recoil that had nearly dislocated his shoulder. The weighted bolts were more symmetrical now, their fins hammered into truer shape, their balance points corrected by instinct as much as by measurement. Tom ran his thumb along the new launcher's rim, feeling a quiet satisfaction. Not pride, not exactly. More like the feeling one has when the pieces of a puzzle finally sit in their proper places. He only hoped it would work as well in truth as it did in theory. When he stepped onto the deck, the rain had begun. A fine mist at first, then heavier droplets that struck the surface in noisy patterns. The crew moved with sluggish purpose, rubbing sleep from their eyes as they prepared for another day of unpredictable patrols. A storm wasn't ideal for scouting, nor was it ideal for being scouted, but weather rarely deterred the Germans entirely. In fact, it sometimes emboldened them. Low clouds meant stealth. Tom leaned on the railing, letting the cold rain wash over his face. He had barely been topside 2 minutes when the lookout's voice cut sharply through the wind. "Aircraft!" Every head snapped upward. Tom's pulse jolted. "Where?" Harrington shouted as he burst from the wheelhouse. "Southwest, sir. Low altitude, closing fast." The crew scrambled, boots pounding, shouts echoing across the wet deck. Tom squinted into the murk. And then he saw it, a stuttering silhouette cutting through the rain, wings angled sharply downward. But this wasn't a scout plane. It was sleeker, faster, its engine note deeper and more menacing. A fighter, a German Bf-109. The storm had hidden it until the last moment. The enemy hadn't come to observe, it had come to kill. "Gunnery crews!" Harrington barked. "Move! Move!" The Lewis guns swung upward. The Vickers on the stern rattled to life, sending bursts of tracer fire streaking blindly into the rain. But the fighter was no sluggish reconnaissance craft. It dove in a clean, deadly arc, the pilot calculating distance with practiced ease. A flash of muzzle fire erupted from its wings. A line of bullets stitched across the water, then the hull. Wood splintered. A sailor cried out. Another ducked behind a coil of rope as sparks exploded inches from his head. Tom didn't hesitate. He dashed back toward the companionway, the rain hammering against the deck. Harrington saw him go and shouted, "Whitcomb, not again, there's no time." But Tom was already gone. He reached the workshop in seconds, chest heaving, hands shaking. The new launcher lay exactly where he left it. He grabbed it, ignoring the new ache in his shoulder, and slung the strap over his back. The weighted bolts went into a canvas bag he tied around his waist. Then he charged back topside as the ship shuddered from another strafing run. The fighter screamed overhead, so low Tom could see the pilot's goggles flash as he passed. The Kestrel rocked under the pressure of its slipstream, ropes flailing, loose canvas snapping violently. Tom dropped to one knee on the port side again, the very spot where he had fired the first launcher the day before. Rain soaked his hair, his jacket, the launcher itself. Water dripped into his eyes. His fingers slipped twice as he loaded the first bolt, but he forced himself steady. He lifted the launcher. This was no scout drifting lazily across the horizon. This was a fast-moving predator, one that could tear the Kestrel open in minutes. Harrington rushed toward him, face half lit by flashes of gunfire. "Whitcomb, you can't possibly track a fighter with that thing!" Tom didn't answer. He listened, really listened, to the fighter's engine, its pitch, its rhythm, its method. The pilot was circling around for another run. Fighters didn't linger. They attacked in patterns, predictable arcs, predictable timing. The ship lurched again. The crew scrambled for cover. The Lewis gunners tried to adjust their aim, but every time they centered the aircraft, it had already streaked past them. Tom closed his eyes for the briefest moment. He pictured the fighter's flight path, the angle of approach, the moment it would need to commit to a dive, and when he opened them again, he lifted the launcher as if it were an extension of his own arm. The fighter came screaming in from starboard, banking hard, levelling its wings for another strafing pass. The rain streaked behind it in thin lines. Its engine roared like a wild thing locked in fury. Tom waited. He did not rush. He did not panic. He counted the seconds in his head. Then he fired. The bolt tore upward in a violent arc, clean, fast, true. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, but the new design absorbed enough of the blow that he stayed upright. For a heartbeat, he saw nothing. Then the fighter jerked. A burst of sparks flared near the engine cowling. The aircraft wobbled, fighting the sudden loss of control. It veered left, then right, spraying an accidental burst of gunfire across empty sky. The pilot tried to pull up, but the plane wasn't climbing as cleanly as before. "You hit it!" someone shouted. But Tom wasn't done. He reloaded with shaking hands, the rain turning his grip slick. The fighter wasn't out. It was merely wounded. A single bolt wouldn't guarantee anything. He needed another. Fast. The fighter arced upward, coughing smoke. It wasn't retreating. It was repositioning. A wounded predator was still a predator. "Come on," Tom whispered as he locked the second bolt into place. The aircraft looped sharply through the storm, the sound of its engine struggling to maintain momentum. The pilot pushed it, forcing the fighter into another dive. One more strike to finish the Kestrel before his damaged aircraft failed completely. The rain battered the deck. The ship tilted. Tom steadied the launcher with both hands. The fighter leveled its wings and committed to the dive. Tom fired again. The second bolt shot through the rain like a spear hurled by the sky itself. It hit the fighter's underside, punching through the weakened metal with brutal force. A bloom of fire erupted near the fuselage. The aircraft lurched sideways, smoke pouring from its engine. Its dive turned into a tumble, its wings flailing uselessly. The men aboard the Kestrel watched as the German fighter spun downward in a desperate, chaotic spiral. The pilot fought to regain control, but gravity dragged the crippled machine toward the churning sea. It hit the waves with a violent hiss, disappearing beneath the surface almost instantly. The ship fell silent again. Only the storm spoke. Tom lowered the launcher, his breath shaking, his arms heavy. His whole body felt as though it had been struck by lightning, not from fear, not from pride, from the sheer impossibility of what had just happened. Harrington approached him slowly, rain streaking his face, his coat drenched. He didn't speak at first. He simply stared at Tom as though he were something unreal, something forged from equal parts madness and brilliance. Then he said quietly, "Whitcomb, I think you've changed naval warfare in ways the Admiralty isn't prepared to understand." Tom swallowed hard, lifting the launcher slightly. "It still needs work, sir." Harrington laughed then, a tired, disbelieving sound. "Yes, and God help us all when you finish it." The storm raged on, but the men aboard the Kestrel moved with a lightness that defied the weather. They had survived something they were never meant to survive. They had fought back with something improvised, something born not from official design, but from the restless, relentless mind of a sailor who refused to be helpless. Tom walked toward the bow, staring into the endless grey horizon. The war wasn't over. There would always be another plane, another threat, another impossible moment demanding a solution that didn't yet exist. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would meet each one with his hands, his mind, and whatever pieces of scrap the sea offered him. Because sometimes victory didn't come from factories or official arsenals. Sometimes it came from a sailor bending metal in a stormlit workshop, building hope out of pipes.